idea that time is an illusion is something that philosophers have wondered about for 2,500 years.
So time basically can go backwards and forwards if you look at the microscopic equation. So there must be another reason why it appears to go forward.
And so actually what we should expect is there to be quite a complicated story of how it is that for creatures like us perceiving time, we end up perceiving it in the way that we do, even if it might look quite different at the fundamental level.
People who think about time as being static, they're just missing out on this fundamental feature of the world. The idea that time is an illusion is something that philosophers have wondered about for 2,500 years. The idea that time is just an appearance and not just time, that change is just an appearance, was worried about back with the pre-Socratics. What is quite new, relatively, is the idea that now, that the present moment might or might not be an illusion. So I think that about 100 years ago, people who thought that time was real conceived time to be static, a kind of block universe in which past, present, future are all real. And they saw time as kind of like a fourth dimension of space. So in the same way that in space you can move in any direction and no direction is privileged, I think people thought the same about time. And there were various reasons why that was so. So things like timelines had become really popular. They were invented in 1765. The very idea of plotting events on a timeline is something that's quite new. And as soon as you start to think about events on a line, you have something that's static. A line is something that doesn't move. And I think that's one of the things that led people to think about time as a static dimension. What you then get in late 19th, early 20th century is an absolute rebellion against this idea. So people like Henry Bergson in France and Arthur Eddington in Britain began saying, no, if you think that time is just like space, then it means that there's nothing special about the present moment. There's no now that's ever moving, ever flowing forwards. You just have moments of time spread out, and there's nothing special about now. And they really disliked that view. They thought that, on the contrary, there is something really special about the present, that we feel time flowing and moving forwards, and that people who think about time as being static and the present as just being an illusion, that they're just missing out on this fundamental feature of the world. So I think this is how this debate got started, whether or not the present is an illusion. I think it all kicked off about 100 years ago.
Why would time not be real? Time refers to duration, that is, experienced change. Everything you see around you is constantly changing. Even if you move your head, that's change. And even if you see complete blackness, there's still change in terms of the accumulation of memory. So you can't avoid duration in prosaic consciousness and everyday consciousness. Duration is part of lived experience. So that's the most common notion of time. Of course, time itself, in that sense, then, when I say time, it's an abstraction from duration. So the real thing we experience is the change, the perception of the change of things, and of our mind, and from that whole experience, we sort of extract the abstraction that is time, and then often, in physics especially, we put time on a timeline, an abstracted spatial representation of time. Secondly, we must distinguish, when we talk about time, the triplicity, that is past, present, and future. This is the essence of time, according to Jeremy McTaggart, who was a British idealist at Cambridge. He wrote this great text in 1908, published it in 1908, called The Unreality of Time, where he argues that the past, present, and future which is the essence of time, is merely subjective. It can't really be properties of events themselves because they couldn't have all those three attributes at once. In physics and science, there is no such thing as the present moment as compared to the past and the future. The present moment is determined by the mind itself. So you take away the mind, and you've taken away that fundamental aspect of time itself. What are you left with? Well, you can still talk about the order of events, C-series, as McTaggart calls it, which are not subjective, but objective. So, first A happens, and B, then C, then D, then E, and so on and so forth. Another aspect of time, very important, is what William James called the specious present. The specious present, the length of the present moment, the now, is very much determined, again, by our minds, and it can extend and it can contract. Related to that is what Henri Bergson calls the rhythm of duration, or the speed of time. And even this is very subjective, which means that speed of time can change according to one's predicament, human's predicament, but also according to species. So there is evidence that different species perceive time faster or slower than we do. For example, a fly might perceive our whacking of it in slow motion, unfortunately. Fourthly, we can consider time as the fourth spatial dimension, vis-a-vis Minkowski and Einstein. Minkowski was Einstein's mathematics teacher. I mean, there was before 1905, when the first theory of relativity came out, there were good mathematical theories as to why there were more than three spatial dimensions, stemming really from Riemann, who proved that you can have a geometry based on multiple dimensions of space, not just the three that we presuppose. I mean, Aristotle said that, physicality is three-dimensional. That's just it. There cannot possibly be more without contradiction. But this seemed to be, at least theoretically, mathematically, not right. So Riemann proved that you can get very coherent geometries then based on 4 dimensions, 5 ad infinitum. Minkowski Einstein then, heralding the theory of relativity, said that time is a fourth spatial dimension. This is still controversial, of course. I mean, spatial dimensions are unidirectional. You can go left and right, up and down, forward and backwards, of course, but you can't go backwards in time, it seems. Time seems to be a one-way dimension. There has been proved that one's velocity in space affects the speed of time. So the faster you go, the slower time goes relative to other times. And also, interestingly, then with gravity, the closer you are to a gravitational point, the faster time goes as well.
Time doesn't really exist. And this is an emergence of time that actually comes from a quantum mechanical description. Yes, time is a mysterious property of our world around us. We experience it. I'm going to talk about it as a theoretical physicist. I'm not a philosopher. So let me first explain what time means in physics, and then I'll go indeed further into my recent ideas about why time might emerge from. So in physics, we think about time as evolving forward. We even use it that way. We use the past to determine the state of the present. And then we have a logical way in which events occur. We call this causality, in the sense that we have cause and effect, where cause precedes the effect. And you cannot change this around. There's also a very intimate connection between time and space. This is in relativity, where we can even transform time and space into each other. So there's no absolute meaning of time. When you start moving around, clocks work differently depending on your velocity. So what determines the direction of time? There are some ideas that relate it to entropy, because entropy is a notion that we say has to increase towards the future, and then maybe we should say that the direction of time is determined by entropy. I think that's a misconception, because I think microscopically the laws are time symmetric, and you can derive this law of the second law of thermodynamics, which implies the increase of entropy, from these microscopic laws, which are reversible. So time basically can go backwards and forwards if you look at the microscopic equation. So there must be another reason why it appears to go forward. Then there's the idea that maybe that if I really know what's the state today, can I calculate what's going on tomorrow? Is there determinism? Can I really determine what is the next state? In physics, many people believe this, that once we know the microscopic laws, then we can compute everything. I don't think that's possible. That's sort of a local way of determinism that is going too far. I think nature is fundamentally non-local. That means that we have to really know the entire state to know what the future is. And it's also quantum mechanical. And this is where I think my ideas are sort of coming from, is that the way we are thinking about the universe should be in terms of quantum mechanics, and then even we can understand the nature of space and time in a different way. So those are the recent ideas we've been developing together with colleagues. We've looked at what happens near horizon. So horizon is a part of space where clocks can even slow down so that they appear to be sort of no time left. So this is where we can understand better where time comes from. And then the following picture appears. So in quantum mechanics, we can start from a state where there's no time. You simply know the state of the system. But then the way that time appears is if you are asking questions about only the things that we can see, what like the visible part of the universe, but they're also part that we cannot see. And then we have ignored that part. And then suddenly what happens is that in our world, in our perception, time appears, but it's relative to the part that we cannot see. So time appears to flow forward because there's another part of the whole microscopic world where it sort of appears to go the other way. And this is an emergence of time that actually comes from a quantum mechanical description. So microscopically, I really believe that time doesn't really exist. So it's something that we have invented or at least used in our daily experience. But if you ask me, does the real microscopic universe know what time is? Probably not. But we have something in place that eventually can sort of from a microscopic language tell us what time then is, how it appears. So this is called the theory of emergence. That's really the idea that things that we are using in our common language are not really meaningful at a microscopic scale. So time is also one of those notions. So eventually, I think, can we really answer the question what time is? I think that's a difficult one. I mean, even the beginning of time, like the Big Bang, I think is a question that is going to be, central to all of understanding what time is. But it's going to be a long time before we have answered those questions.
In space-time, there are fundamentally three different types of directions: the future-directed, the past-directed, and the space-like directed. I think we feel it's going forward because it is. In space, there really is no preferred directionality. If you imagine in a three-dimensional Euclidean space, you have arrows pointing all different ways, and they don't. You wouldn't know even what to make if someone asked, well, which way is space going? You say, well, it's not going anywhere, But even in relativity, when we got rid of this absolute simultaneity, you have this light cone structure, and that structure divides directions in space-time into different classes. You have the future light cone, and you have all these directions that are, as it were, pointing to the future. You have the past light cone, and you have all these directions that are pointing to the past. And you can't rotate from down here to up here without going through the whole outside bit, right? The whole outside bit, which is connected, points in what we call space-like directions. So just that structure says, yeah, in space-time, there are fundamentally three different types of directions: the future-directed, the past-directed, and the, as it were, space-like directed. And one obvious explanation for that is because time is an intrinsically directed quantity. It has a direction to it. And I think a lot of the confusion comes because the mathematics that had been developed to understand spatial structure was very powerful and new and interesting. And if you're a mathematician or a physicist, you learn a lot about that. But that was developed to describe space. And there is no intrinsic directionality to space. And then when it came to trying to describe space-time, the natural thing to do was to pull off the shelf this mathematics that was already there and use it, which is what people did. And then they looked at it and they said, but there's no direction in there. But that's just a kind of failure in the mathematics. It's pretty easy to solve that and to develop a mathematical structure for describing intrinsically directed quantities like time.
Here I see a big role for physics as well as psychology in explaining how we are going to think of time as something special. There's a lot of speculations about how we're going to come up with a final theory, particularly one that can put together what we're learning about space-time from general relativity and what's happening at the quantum mechanical level. Nevertheless, when it comes to talking about people at the kind of energy and length scales and what's going on at the kind of environments that we inhabit, we know pretty much how that story looks. And in the kind of physics we're using in this setting, there doesn't seem to be a lot of the parts of the intuitive package of time that Hugh was just talking about. So these kinds of physics, they don't indicate a special moment that's present, they don't discuss a flow of time, and they don't have an intrinsic direction to time itself. One could take that as a reason to think that the science is incomplete or missing something fundamental. But I guess my view is part of a trend recently to think that's not the right way of reading the situation. It would be a big surprise if our direct experience of the world could deliver what things are actually like at the fundamental level. And so actually what we should expect is there to be quite a complicated story of how it is that for creatures like us perceiving time, we end up perceiving it in the way that we do, even if it might look quite different at the fundamental level. So here I see a big role for physics as well as psychology in explaining how, given the kind of interests and concerns we have, we are going to think of time as something special, having these features. James mentioned the block universe. I think it might be worth having that on the table. So according to the picture of science that works by and large for us, we can think of events in the past and future as just as real as the events now. We can sort of line them up in these kind of spatial layers, with time as one dimension and space as the other three dimensions. And all parts of the block are equally as real as each other. No moment is privileged as what is objectively now. Time is, in a sense, a little bit like space, in that just as you can refer to here and you mean wherever you mean, from where you're standing, and I can say here and I mean something different, but we're not, as it were, having a deep disagreement. Similarly, there aren't special moments of time. If I say now, it just means the moment where I'm speaking. You can say now 2 minutes later, and you just mean a different moment.
There is quite a different way of thinking about space-time, which is much more like Newtonian dynamics. There is an alternative way of thinking about time, space-time, where you don't think of it as a block that's given once and for all, or even that it's growing, which I think is, we could talk about that, because a lot of people who think it's growing now believe that this collapse of the wave function is causing it to grow, which I think is very questionable. There is quite a different way of thinking about space-time, which is much more like Newtonian dynamics, where basically you can think about it as being one three-dimensional structure, another one like that, another one like that, and they are put together, so you put the one triangle relative to the other, in which the difference between them is reduced to a minimum. So you can stack one like that. So the next three-dimensional structure, you put it on top of that, and then you put it in a certain separation from it, which is a measure of the amount of difference between them at each point. That's duration. That's where you're getting duration out of difference, and you go on building up like that. Once you've built up space-time like that, you can cut it in any way you like, or you can travel through it in any way you like. Hidden in this wonderful structure that Einstein discovered, there might be a unique way of defining a simultaneity within Einstein's general theory of relativity, not his special theory of relativity. And it's very, very beautiful, because in three-dimensional space, you know how beautiful a soap bubble is. It has what's called constant mean curvature. The curvature of the soap bubble is always perfect. And this very special way that and quite a lot of relativists take this seriously, that may exist in space-time, is analogous to soap bubbles in 4 dimensions. And that's called constant mean curvature foliation, if you want the technical word. So I would say there may, after all, be a notion of simultaneity. But whichever way you cut that loaf of bread, if you cut it through that way, you will always get a three-dimensional structure. So I think my notion of a now survives even then, and I think it will also survive in any quantum theory of the universe, or at least I think there's a reasonable chance.
Our belief that there is something like a time dimension and that nature has something like time in it, nobody here is disputing.
I take it that we naively all do feel we have a direct experiential experience of time flowing, don't we?
Sure, but that's evidence for something in fundamental physics is a much larger
different thing.
assertion.
You are then brought back to this notion of either we have to say to people, I know that's how it feels, but for some weird reason it's not true, which from an evolutionary point of view is very odd, because evolution doesn't usually, successful creatures who have evolved, don't usually believe something that's false.
But this belief that, I mean, hang on, our belief that there is something like a time dimension and that nature has something like time in it, obviously that's, nobody here is disputing that. It's the idea that the way that we experience that time dimension and the fact that it's very different from the way that we experience the spatial dimension, does that piece of evidence give us reason to think that not only does time play a slightly different role in our physics, but does it have this completely different metaphysical character?
Yes, it's not laid out like the other dimensions.
Exactly, and that's the question here. So it's not that we'll be completely mistaken about our ideas about time if the eternalist is correct. It's just whether this one bit of our experience is really something that's there in the fundamental reality, or whether, like many aspects of our experience that Lee brought up earlier, it's actually some kind of product of the kinds of creatures we are and the way that we interact with the world.
You said if the eternalists are correct. What does correct mean?
So I have I suppose I actually have trouble with this debate because I have a lot of trouble understanding what the alternative. I understand what it is to sort of say, look, everything we're positing in physics, it's all real. And that's fine, and all of these facts that we're predicting, and if they're correct, they're all real. I have a lot of trouble understanding what it is to say only one subset of those facts, namely the ones that are happening right now, are real, which is the presentist claim. So I can only present the eternalist view as the one that I understand, which is just the common, dinosaurs, they're real, they're not at the same time as us, and maybe space travel's real, it's not at the same time as us either. But there's no sort of special status apart from being at different times those things have.
But I don't know what a non-eternalist is, but whoever he is, he doesn't dispute dinosaurs, does he?
No, he says it's very important that they did exist, and that's a different fact from the fact that I say they exist kind of tenselessly, but in the past, but at a different time from me. And I think someone like Lee needs to think that there's something very special about saying that the dinosaurs don't now exist and they did exist. You're sort of expressing some fact that goes beyond just the fact that they're at a temporal distance from me.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.